Police believed Chelsea Whitby had something to hide in the weeks following the death of her son, Emerson. That's what officers said when they questioned her the day after she was arrested and charged.
There are stories that stay with you long after they end, not because of how shocking they are, but because of how quietly they reveal the cracks in our world. This is one of those stories. It begins with a bright little boy whose laughter once filled every room, a boy everyone called Buggy. He was just 18 months old, too young to understand what danger looked like, too innocent to know that sometimes the people meant to protect us can also fail us. In the spring of 2020, in the quiet city of Regina, Canada, something happened that would leave an entire community in disbelief. It wasn't a headline filled with violence or scandal. It was something far sadder, a case that exposed how fragile trust can be when justice arrives too late. For the prosecutors and investigators, it became another complicated file in a crowded system. But for one small child and the people who loved him, it was everything. Tonight, we're not here to sensationalize a tragedy. We're here to remember, to understand, and to ask the questions that too often go unanswered. What happens when warning signs are ignored? When compassion gives way to hesitation? And when a life so young slips through the cracks of bureaucracy? Who is left to speak for it? This is the story of Emerson Whitby. A story about love, fear, and the painful silence that followed. A story that reminds us how easily systems can break and how important it is that we never stop asking what could have been done differently. Emerson William Bryan Whitby was born on December 2, 2018 in Regina, Canada. From the moment he arrived, his family described him as light itself, cheerful, curious, and endlessly full of life. His grandmother loved to call him Buggy because he never stopped moving. He would crawl, stumble, and toddle his way through every corner of the house, as if the world was one big adventure waiting for him. Every smile, every giggle became a small reminder of hope for the people around him. His parents, Chelsea Whitby and Riley Jolly, had a complicated relationship. They tried to make it work, but by the time Emerson was born, things had already begun to fall apart. They decided to separate, yet promised to share the care of their son equally. Riley adored his boy. He was the kind of father who never missed a weekend, who proudly took his son to the park, teaching him how to balance on the swings, how to laugh at the little things. Chelsea, meanwhile, was rebuilding her life. She worked, cared for her son, and eventually met a man named Taylor Stewart. Taylor had once worked in the oil industry and was a father himself, raising 2 young daughters from a previous marriage. When he moved into Chelsea's apartment in early 2020, the small home suddenly became filled with the sound of 3 children laughing, playing, and tumbling over toys. To the neighbors, it seemed like a happy, blended family, the kind of household where love had been given a second chance. The laughter of children echoed through the thin apartment walls, and nobody could have guessed that within just a few months, those same walls would witness something that would break a family apart. Because behind the smiles, something unseen was beginning to shift, a tension no one fully recognized until it was too late. By mid-April 2020, the happy picture around little Emerson began to blur. His father, Riley, started noticing something that unsettled him deeply. Small bruises on his son's ribs, faint at first, then more visible with every visit. At the beginning, he tried to believe the simple explanations: a fall, a bump, a clumsy moment from a toddler still learning to walk. But over the next few weeks, the bruises didn't fade. They multiplied, appearing on Emerson's cheek, near his ear, even a tender spot on the top of his head where his soft curls were thinning. Riley felt a quiet panic growing inside him. Chelsea hadn't mentioned any accidents, something that was unlike her. She'd always been quick to call or message whenever their son got even the smallest scratch. This time, she said nothing, until Riley asked. Her answer was calm, almost rehearsed. She told him Emerson was fine, that he was just an active little boy, always bumping into things. "He's tougher than he looks," she laughed. But the reassurance didn't feel right. Then came May 26th. When Riley arrived to pick up his son, his heart froze. Emerson's eyes were swollen and darkened, 2 deep bruises that no longer looked like the result of simple play. Chelsea said he had fallen out of his crib. Riley didn't argue. He took Emerson straight to his mother, Darla, who was horrified by what she saw. They decided to take him to the doctor, who warned them to go to the hospital if the swelling worsened. That evening, as the bruises deepened, Riley called Chelsea again. She refused to bring Emerson in, insisting it wasn't necessary, claiming black eyes often looked worse before they healed. Torn between fear and the fragile custody arrangement, Riley contacted social services instead. He sent photos and asked for help. When police arrived at Chelsea's apartment, they found her outside, crying and leaning on Taylor for comfort. Inside, Emerson's face bore the same marks Riley had described. Authorities placed the boy temporarily with his grandmother, a moment of relief that didn't last. Just days later, social workers decided to return Emerson to his mother, believing supervision from Chelsea's own mom would be enough. It was a decision that, in hindsight, would haunt everyone involved. Less than a week after Emerson was returned to his mother's care, Riley noticed that his son seemed different. The little boy who was usually full of energy was now quieter, irritable, and easily upset. During one of their visits, Emerson cried through most of the car ride, clinging to his father in a way that made Riley's heart ache. He assumed his son was just tired or hungry. Toddlers have off days, he told himself. But something inside him felt wrong. That day, June 9th, 2020, Emerson spent time at his grandmother Darla's house. For a while, things seemed normal. He played with his toys, smiled faintly, even managed a small laugh. But by late afternoon, his energy began to fade. He refused his bath, whimpered softly when Riley tried to comfort him. It was as if a light inside him was dimming. At around 8:30 that night, Riley brought Emerson back to Chelsea's apartment. The child looked exhausted. Within moments of arriving, he became unwell, and Riley helped clean up before leaving, trusting Chelsea to settle him for the night. She later called her mother, Lisa, to help soothe Emerson, thinking perhaps he had an upset stomach. The next morning, around 8:15 a.m., Chelsea and her partner Taylor woke up, along with Taylor's 2 daughters. They checked the baby monitor. Emerson appeared to be asleep, lying still in his crib. Since he had gone to bed late and hadn't been feeling well, they decided to let him rest. An hour later, Taylor left to buy milk and a few groceries. When he returned, Chelsea came rushing down the stairs, holding Emerson in her arms, her voice trembling. "He's not breathing!" Taylor immediately tried to perform first aid, while Chelsea called emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly and managed to stabilize him, but it was too late. By the time Emerson reached the hospital, doctors confirmed that his brain had suffered irreversible damage. They found injuries no one could explain: bruises, swelling, internal trauma. The conclusion was devastating. The harm wasn't accidental. For the medical team, the truth was undeniable. For the family, it was unbearable. When the investigation began, Chelsea appeared calm but fragile. She told the officers that she had been too afraid to take Emerson to the hospital earlier because of health risks at the time. She repeated that her son bruised easily, that he was learning to walk, bumping into furniture, falling often. It sounded plausible, until the doctor's reports contradicted everything. The bruises were not typical childhood scrapes. They were deeper, patterned, and inconsistent with accidental injury. During questioning, Chelsea offered several explanations. She said that some of the marks came from playful roughhousing with Taylor's daughters, others from a fall near a window, and one from a slip on the stairs outside her mother's house. But one injury could not be explained at all: a healed fracture in Emerson's ribs, found during an earlier hospital visit. The evidence didn't fit neatly together, and investigators began to suspect there was more behind the story. Taylor Stewart, her partner, was also questioned. He told police that the boy had seemed tired, but otherwise fine the night before. He admitted that Emerson had occasionally been scolded, but insisted there was never any harsh discipline. His statement seemed honest until investigators told him that only 3 people had been present that night: him, Chelsea, and his 2 daughters. That made him a potential suspect. Still, Taylor cooperated. He agreed to take a polygraph test in July. But the morning of the test, tragedy struck again. Taylor was found dead in his truck, parked in a rural area outside Edenwold. Notes to his family revealed that he had battled depression for years. His death stunned the community and shattered the investigation. For detectives, the case had now lost one of its key witnesses. For Chelsea, it brought even more suspicion. In wiretapped calls, she told a psychic she felt responsible for Taylor's death and worried that police would blame him for what happened to Emerson. She also urged Taylor, before his death, not to speak too freely with investigators. Theories began to divide the public. Some believed Chelsea had lost control in a moment of frustration. Others thought the system had already failed her, that mental health, stress, and grief had collided in the worst possible way. But through it all, one question echoed in every report, every courtroom, every broken heart. What really happened inside that apartment on June 10th, 2020? When the charges were finally filed in August 2020, Chelsea Whitby stood accused of one of the most serious crimes imaginable, the loss of her own child's life. For months, she maintained her innocence, and by the time the trial began in 2023, the community had grown divided. Some saw her as a grieving mother trapped in a storm of suspicion. Others saw her as the only person who could explain the unexplainable. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors argued that Emerson's death had been the result of frustration that turned physical. They pointed to the pattern of injuries, to the timing of events, to the fact that Emerson's condition worsened only after being returned to his mother's care. They insisted that the blunt force trauma revealed by doctors could not have been accidental. The defense, however, presented a different story. They claimed Emerson's brain injury was a rebleed, the recurrence of an old injury, rather than a new act of harm. They brought medical experts to support the theory that the hemorrhage might have been delayed and spontaneous. Chelsea's lawyer emphasized that she had cooperated with authorities, that she had no history of violence, and that she had sought help for postpartum anxiety and depression, which she never hid. Witnesses took the stand one by one. A former boyfriend recalled a single moment years earlier when Chelsea, overwhelmed while breastfeeding, had swatted Emerson's hand in frustration, a detail the prosecution used to question her temper. Riley, the boy's father, told the court of nights when Chelsea grew impatient, of the time she pressed Emerson's face into a pillow when he wouldn't sleep. None of these moments resulted in injury, but they lingered like faint shadows of possibility. After weeks of testimony, the judge faced a decision that would echo far beyond the courtroom. The evidence was circumstantial. No one had seen what happened that morning. In the end, Justice Catherine Durson ruled that there were reasonable alternative explanations for Emerson's death. Explanations that did not prove intentional harm. The verdict stunned everyone. The charges were dropped. Chelsea walked free. For the law, the case was closed. But for Emerson's family, and for everyone who followed the trial, closure was impossible. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent, not in relief, but in disbelief. Emerson's father, Riley, stared ahead, his expression empty. For him, justice had slipped through his fingers like sand. He had trusted the system to protect his son, to speak for the child who no longer could. Now, all he had left were photographs, memories, and an ache that would never fade. Outside the courthouse, reporters spoke in measured tones about the judge's decision, about reasonable doubt, about legal technicalities. But behind those words lay something deeper, a quiet understanding that sometimes justice does not heal, it only defines the limits of what can be proven. In Regina, the community struggled to move on. Some people felt sympathy for Chelsea, believing she had been broken by grief and circumstance. Others felt anger that no one would ever be held accountable. The questions hung heavy in the air. How could a child with visible injuries be sent back home so quickly? Why didn't someone insist on another medical examination? Why didn't anyone stop to listen to a father's fear before it was too late? Years may pass and official records may close, but the silence around Emerson's story still speaks loudly. It reminds everyone that behind every statistic, behind every headline, there is a human life, fragile, dependent, and far too easy to overlook. For the Whitby family, and for anyone who has ever lost faith in the systems meant to protect us, Emerson's name remains a quiet plea. Don't look away next time. In the end, all that remains of Emerson Whitby is a small collection of photographs, a smiling toddler with bright eyes, chubby cheeks, and a spark that once filled a home with laughter. His nickname, Buggy, still echoes softly in the hearts of those who loved him most. It's hard to imagine that someone so full of joy could become the center of such a painful story. But Emerson's story is not just about loss. It's a mirror held up to a system that sometimes forgets the smallest voices. It's a reminder that bureaucracy, hesitation, and fear can be as dangerous as violence itself. Because every delayed decision, every ignored sign, can carry a cost that no courtroom can undo. We may never know what truly happened on that June morning, whether it was anger, confusion, or a moment of irreversible tragedy. What we do know is that a child's life was cut short, and with it, the chance to grow, to dream, to become. So as we close this chapter, let us remember Emerson not for how he died, but for how he lived, full of wonder, laughter, and love. If this story moved you, share it. Speak about it. Awareness is the first step toward change. Because the next time a child like Emerson cries for help, the world must be ready to listen. Rest in peace, little Buggy. You are not forgotten.